I wanted to chat through our route and how we've chosen the route that we've gone on and why we did the route that we did. And in order to discuss the reasons for that, unfortunately, we need to get into that favourite of all topics of everybody, which is Brexit, because it has implications. And Prior to Brexit, it was very easy to travel from the UK to Europe, to France, to Schengen, to wherever you wanted to go to, and it was very, very easy. There was no real paperwork involved, no real hassle of checking in or checking out, or having to go to the customs office or anything like that. However, we decided, as a UK as a whole, to give up our freedom of movement in the UK, or freedom of movement in Europe and in Schengen, which now means that we have to go through a bit of a customs process. So, what that means is that when you are travelling from the UK to France, firstly, there's a little bit of paperwork you have to do when you leave the UK. Thankfully, as of this year, the government's made that pretty easy. There's an online portal, you create an account, you put in your details there. So, as a sailor, that includes information about the boat, it includes the passengers that's on board, or your passport details, things like that. And then you tell them when you're leaving the UK, and that logs it in the UK, and that goes to HMRC and to customs and to everyone else who needs to know, because there's two parts to that. There's immigration, which is the people involved, but then there's also customs, which is the sort of items involved. So when you're on a boat, you're taking a relatively high value item in and out of countries, so you have to inform them about that. So that's all fairly easy. The next part of the process is to decide where you're going to in France. Now, since we left the EU and we left the customs union and the single market and we gave up freedom of movement, you have to go to what is known as a port of entry. Prior to Brexit, you could literally sail to France, go to any single bit of France you liked. You could just drop an anchor wherever you wanted to, or sail into any small port. That was all fine. Now there are specific places that you have to use to get into Europe or get into France. So in the Channel, there's only really a few that you need to think about. In the Far East, from my perspective, of coming from Devon, there's Cherbourg and a couple of others around that area of France. And you move along down the coast, you get to Saint Malo, and then as you come further west, there is Roscoff. Now, Roscoff is the obvious one if you're sailing from South Devon like I am, if you're setting off from Plymouth or Salcombe, so that's all great. The challenge we had is that we have to plan on the basis of our sort of slowest possible travelling speed, which is about 5 knots. And the distance from Plymouth to Roscoff, or if you made it slightly shorter, if you went from Salcombe to Roscoff, is still about 16 to 18 hours of travel, which means if we're going as slow as we might do and we have to plan for that risk, that means that there aren't enough daylight hours to do that in daylight. And this early in our sort of journey, just setting off, still feeling a little bit rusty, just getting used to the boat and things, we didn't fancy doing a night sail. We thought it'd be nicer to do all our travel in daylight as much as possible. So what we did is we did a day sail from Plymouth to Salcombe, which is about 25 miles, nice and easy, and then we set off from Salcombe really early in the morning, about 5 a.m, just after dawn really, and we headed to Guernsey. So that is a shorter trip going to St Peter's Port in Guernsey than it is going to Roscoff. It means we can do it all in daylight hours. Took us about 13 and a half hours. Set off early in the morning. Arrived sort of middle of the afternoon, early evening. We then had to get from Guernsey into France. So initially, and this is quite important really, we thought we had to travel to Roscoff because that is the official port of entry, and we could have gone to Saint Malo and other places, but that would have been going kind of wrong way because ultimately we're looking to head west around the coast of France and then head south. So Roscoff was the one that made sense, but that's still quite a journey from Guernsey, and that was still going to be a long passage. And because of the tide that you get, which sort of goes into the channel and out of the channel every 5 or 6 hours, it was going to mean we would be with the tide for some of the way, but against the tide for some of the journey also. So it's going to be quite a long passage and just not ideal. So, thankfully, there are a number of smaller ports in Brittany that effectively petitioned the French customs to allow them to become temporary ports of entry during the summer months. And one of those is Treguer, and Treguer is an obvious choice to go to from Guernsey because it's kind of on that little tip of France that sticks out on that side. So it's a much, much shorter journey and is easily done in daylight hours. It's a less complicated journey, it's shorter, it's just easier. So these new ports of entry aren't really full ports of entry. They're kind of a fudge, I suppose, that the French government has done, or the French customs has chosen to do, based on the fact they were petitioned by these particular ports in Brittany. I think what they were finding was that fewer and fewer people, especially British people is what I mean, were going to those ports because you kind of had to go to Roscoff to check in, or you had to go to San Malo to check in. So people weren't landing in those places like they would have done sort of pre-Brexit and pre-COVID. So they've got a temporary arrangement that allows you to check in these places. Again, fairly easy process. You have to email a form. Actually, you have to email the port requesting the form. Then you fill that form in, email that to the port 24 hours before you're due to arrive. They send that to the customs office, and then about a day later, before your trip and before you arrive, you receive a PDF which has got your official sort of check-in, and that's in lieu of a stamp in your passport, which is what you'd normally expect at a check-in port. So that's great, but there are some challenges with that. These temporary Brittany ports of entry are only valid if you're going in and out of those particular ports. What you can't do is check in Treguer and then, say, travel around to Roscoff, and if you're planning to go back to the UK, check out of Roscoff and go back to the UK. Or if you're doing what we're doing, where we're thinking of going on and probably checking out of La Rochelle ultimately, before heading further south, then yeah, you just can't do that. These are only designed to check in these Brittany ports and then check out of these Brittany ports. But thankfully, what we were able to do, and this is quite important if you're thinking of doing this yourself, if you're a sailor watching this, is you can just check out of those as well. So we checked into Treguer, did all the paperwork for that. A couple of days later when we were leaving, we emailed them again to say we were checking out. So we checked out once more of Treguer and then did the journey to Roscoff. So Treguer to Roscoff is much shorter than going from Guernsey to Roscoff, and that made it again much, much easier for us and much shorter. But then on arrival in Roscoff, it's like we'd never entered France. So we had to put up a little yellow flag on our boat, and we had to go to the ferry terminal in order to check in properly. And at that point, they actually stamped our passports. Again, just like with Treguer, you email them to request a form, and you fill in that form, and then it makes it easier when you get to the ferry terminal. They just find your form that you've done, and then they just check it over and give your passport a stamp. The caveat to all of this, if you are thinking of doing this yourself, is each individual port has its own form. Unlike in the UK, where it's a centralised online portal, it doesn't matter where you're travelling from, you can just do it there. In France, the way they're set up is that each individual port of entry has its own form. So you have to email them or download it from their website, get that specific form, and that's the one that you fill in. And I think my thoughts on that, because there's quite a few people in the sailing community, I see them, I overhear them, who think it's the French who are being quite difficult about this, who are sort of making the British jump through hoops as some maybe punishment for Brexit. And my view is that's not really the case at all. They're just treating us the same as they would have treated, I don't know, someone from America or Canada or Australia. But these ports, these locations, aren't used to checking people in like that. Prior to Brexit, they've not had to check people in or out like this for decades. So they simply don't have the facilities, they don't have the officers, they don't have the staff. And even though they are sort of ramping that up a little bit, they're having to do quite a lot of work, and they're having to pay for all of this because of what we chose to do. So I guess, unfortunately, this is what we democratically decided to do, and so because of that we have to sort of pay that price and pay that penalty of quite significant admin, quite significant red tape, and in the case of us, really affecting your journey and how you travel and how you go about things. When we were going from Treguer, we would have liked to have popped into a couple of other ports, but we weren't allowed to. We had to go straight to Roscoff. It's just the only way you can do it. So it's quite an inconvenience, and hopefully, maybe in time, if the UK and Schengen and the EU and maybe just France can come to some kind of better arrangement, if they can build some bridges and get a closer relationship, some of this paperwork might become a bit easier. And I guess over time as well, if the French government and the French Customs officers are able to put more money into their facilities, into their staff, recruit new people, then they might be able to make it a little bit easier. But still a question mark of who's going to pay for that, I suppose. But there you go. So that's why we did what we did. We did a very long journey because of daylight hours and because of customs, going right the way around the houses from Plymouth to Salcombe to Guernsey to Tregear to Roscoff, rather than just doing the easy thing of going straight from Plymouth to Roscoff. But thankfully that's it now. We haven't got to worry about customs for probably a few weeks until we're down towards La Rochelle and we have to think about it again. So there you go. So that's it for now. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.